Clara had always dreamed of escaping the relentless pace and harsh judgments of city life, and when the opportunity arose to work in a remote mountain village, she seized it with cautious excitement. The village itself was small, almost hidden among towering pine trees and jagged cliffs, a place where everyone knew each other, and the rhythm of life moved slowly, dictated by nature rather than deadlines. Clara arrived on a crisp morning, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, as the scent of pine and wood smoke filled her senses. The villagers stared curiously at the newcomer, whispering among themselves, their words carrying a mixture of curiosity and caution. They spoke of the mountain man who lived at the edge of the forest, a man named Elijah, a figure shrouded in mystery and whispered tragedy. As she followed the narrow, winding path leading toward the forest, Clara caught her first glimpse of Elijah's cabin. Her eyes widened involuntarily, and she murmured almost to herself, "You're bigger than my house!" The cabin was enormous, a rugged yet majestic structure carved into the mountainside, its stone foundation and wooden beams seeming to grow naturally from the landscape itself. It was not just the physical size that impressed her, but the aura of strength and permanence it radiated. There was an unspoken symbolism in the way the cabin dominated the hillside, hinting at the presence of the man who called it home, a presence as vast and imposing as the structure itself. The phrase that slipped from Clara's lips was both literal and figurative, capturing the contrast between her own modest upbringing and the overwhelming magnitude of Elijah's solitary life. Elijah's first appearance only added to the aura of mystique surrounding him. He was chopping wood at the edge of the clearing, his movements precise, practiced, and powerful, each swing of the axe echoing through the forest. His frame was broad, his muscles corded and strong from years of living in isolation, and his face, partially shadowed by a thick beard, carried the weight of untold sorrow. The moment Clara saw him, she felt a mixture of fear, admiration, and curiosity. He was undeniably intimidating, yet there was a subtle vulnerability in the way his shoulders slumped after each swing and the careful attentiveness with which he treated the wood. Their first encounter was brief and tense. Elijah's eyes, sharp and assessing, met Clara's, and for a heartbeat, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Clara, aware of her own inexperience with life in the mountains, approached cautiously, unsure of what to say or how to act. Elijah, reserved and accustomed to solitude, said little, his voice deep and rough, carrying the authority of someone used to commanding his own world. Despite the silence and the awkwardness, Clara sensed something compelling beneath his stoicism, a quiet, unspoken loneliness, a story waiting to be told. As she was led to her modest quarters in the village, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the cabin and its enigmatic inhabitant. The size of the house, the strength of the man, and the air of solitude and sorrow surrounding him created a mixture of awe and apprehension in her mind. She realized, almost instinctively, that her journey in this village would be as much about discovering Elijah as it would be about carving a new life for herself. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks and the sky blazed with orange and purple, Clara resolved to step forward, to confront the intimidating vastness of both the mountain and the man who called it home. Her whispered words, "You're bigger than my house," were the first acknowledgement of the extraordinary presence she had encountered, a presence that would soon shape every aspect of her life. The first encounter between Clara and Elijah was a collision of two worlds, one bright, inquisitive, and cautious, the other dark, solitary, and tightly guarded. After her initial arrival in the village, Clara had spent the morning exploring the outskirts, taking in the towering pines, the distant snow-capped peaks, and the crisp scent of mountain air. She wandered along the edge of a clearing where the forest opened into a small meadow, the sunlight glinting off dew-covered grass. That's when she noticed him. Elijah was chopping wood with precision, each swing of his axe slicing through the logs with rhythmic force. He moved with the ease of someone who had spent decades in physical labor, every motion confident and deliberate. Yet there was a gravity to him that seemed to weigh down the very air around him. His broad frame, tanned and weathered by the harsh mountain climate, was covered in simple, practical clothing. A thick flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves and durable trousers, both dusted with sawdust. His thick beard framed a face that was at once stern and sorrowful, eyes shadowed under a heavy brow that gave him the appearance of a man perpetually lost in thought. Clara's approach was hesitant. She had never encountered someone so physically imposing, so undeniably solitary, and so carefully controlled in their presence. As she stepped closer, trying to make her presence known without startling him, Elijah paused mid-swing. His sharp eyes locked on hers, taking in the small, determined figure of the young woman who dared intrude on his carefully constructed world. The air between them was tense. A silence fell over the clearing, filled only by the distant sound of a creek trickling through the forest. "Can I help you?" Elijah's voice was low, measured, carrying the weight of a man unused to company. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't warm either. Clara swallowed her nervousness, straightened her back, and answered, I'm Clara. I've just arrived in the village. They said you might be needing help around your cabin?" Her words were careful, almost formal, as if the very act of speaking to him was a negotiation. Elijah's eyes flickered with something unidentifiable. Curiosity, suspicion, maybe even a faint spark of hope. But he said nothing at first. Instead, he studied her, as though measuring her intent and her strength, gauging whether she could endure the challenges of life in the mountains. After a long pause, he grunted and nodded slightly, a minimal acknowledgement that she had passed some unspoken threshold of acceptability. He returned to chopping the wood, but now his movements were slower, as if aware of her presence in a more personal way. For Clara, this brief encounter was both exhilarating and terrifying. She sensed that beneath Elijah's stern exterior lay deep currents of loneliness and grief. His initial silence was not hostility, but a shield he had cultivated over years of isolation, a way to protect himself from the world and its potential pain. At the same time, there was something almost magnetic about him, an aura of strength, of quiet power, and of untold stories. She felt drawn to him, compelled to understand the man behind the rugged facade. As she watched him, she realized that her journey in the mountains would not be simple. This man was not just a guardian of his land. He was a fortress of emotion, with walls built high from past wounds. Her role in his life, if she were to have one at all, would require patience, courage, and empathy. Yet Clara also felt a quiet determination rising within her, a belief that people like Elijah, no matter how broken or withdrawn, were not beyond connection, and that perhaps, through careful persistence, she could reach him. Their first encounter ended with no grand gestures, no confessions, and no immediate friendship. But it had planted the seed of curiosity and intrigue, setting the stage for a relationship that would slowly evolve, layer by layer, through trust, vulnerability, and shared understanding. For both Clara and Elijah, the encounter marked the start of a journey, one in which the walls of solitude would be tested, the silence broken, and the quiet ache of loneliness challenged by the possibility of connection. After their first tense encounter in the forest, Clara found herself standing at the edge of Elijah's domain, the cabin that seemed almost alive in its magnitude and isolation. The villagers had warned her that the mountain man was difficult to approach, a soul deeply shaped by loss and solitude, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer presence of his home. It was more than a house. It was a fortress, a sanctuary, and a monument all at once. The stone foundation was rugged and unyielding, while the wooden beams and carved railings suggested a careful hand and an appreciation for craftsmanship. The size and solidity of the cabin mirrored the man himself, imposing, protective, and seemingly impervious to the outside world. Clara's first task was to prove herself capable of functioning within this unusual environment. Her initial days were filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. She cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, tending to areas that had long been neglected. Dusty shelves, weathered furniture, and windows streaked with months of grime were transformed under her diligent care. She chopped firewood, swept the floors, and carried water from a nearby stream, all while carefully observing Elijah's routines. Each of her actions was scrutinized, often silently, by the man whose presence dominated every corner of the cabin. He was not overtly critical, but his watchful eyes conveyed judgment more powerful than words. Life in the mountains was physically demanding, and Clara quickly discovered that it required patience and adaptability. Mornings began before dawn, with the cold seeping into her bones as she carried water to fill the kettle and prepared breakfast on the wood stove. She learned to navigate the uneven terrain, the steep paths, and the dense undergrowth, gradually gaining confidence in her ability to exist in this isolated world. Yet the real challenge was not physical. It was emotional. Every movement she made, every word she spoke, had to respect the unspoken boundaries that Elijah had set over years of solitude. Despite the initial tension, there were moments of subtle connection. Clara noticed the way Elijah treated his surroundings with quiet reverence, the meticulous stacking of wood, the careful placement of tools, and the lingering glances at photographs that lined a shelf near the fireplace. These photos, yellowed with age, depicted a life once filled with people, laughter, and love. The absence of those elements in his current life spoke volumes, and Clara felt a mixture of empathy and resolve. She realized that her presence in the cabin was not just about completing chores. It was about learning to coexist with a man whose heart had been fortified against pain. Communication between them was sparse but meaningful. Elijah rarely spoke unless necessary, his words deliberate and measured. Clara, for her part, learned to read his silences, interpreting them as cues rather than barriers. Slowly, a rhythm developed. She would prepare meals, tidy the cabin, and perform tasks quietly, while he worked in the yard, chopped wood, or repaired sections of the house. Their interactions were minimalist, yet charged with unspoken understanding. Even a shared glance across the room or a small nod in acknowledgement carried weight, signaling a tentative bridge between two very different lives. Clara's persistence and willingness to adapt did not go unnoticed. Elijah, though still guarded, began to allow small glimpses of his personality to surface. He would occasionally comment on her methods, correct her gently, or even offer guidance on how to manage certain tasks more efficiently. These small interactions, though seemingly mundane, were monumental for Clara. They were signs that the walls he had built around his heart were starting to shift. By the end of her first week, Clara felt a cautious sense of belonging. The cabin no longer seemed entirely forbidding. It was a space in which she could exist without fear, where her efforts mattered, and where the mountain man, enigmatic and imposing though he was, acknowledged her presence. This settling-in period marked the first stage of her integration into Elijah's life. It was a time of observation, adaptation, and subtle connection, laying the foundation for the deeper trust and emotional intimacy that would eventually develop between them. As Clara settled into life at Elijah's cabin, the initial novelty of her surroundings and the challenge of mountain living began to wear on her. The tasks that had seemed straightforward at first, cleaning, cooking, fetching water, and tending the garden, quickly revealed themselves to be far more demanding when combined with the unpredictability of living with Elijah. The mountain man's strict routines and high standards became apparent almost immediately, and Clara found herself struggling to meet them while also navigating the subtleties of his temperament. The early days were punctuated by small but telling conflicts. Elijah had lived alone for so long that any disruption to his environment, however minor, felt like an intrusion. Clara, in her eagerness to help, would occasionally misstep. A pan left in the wrong spot, a log stacked imperfectly, or a meal prepared in a way that did not align with his expectations. Each mistake was met with a quiet but firm correction, sometimes accompanied by a curt comment or a disapproving look. These moments were intimidating, as Elijah's authority carried the weight of someone who had built his life meticulously and relied on self-sufficiency as a shield against the world. Clara felt the sting of inadequacy, yet she also recognized that patience and persistence were her only tools for bridging the gap between them. The conflicts extended beyond mere household tasks. Clara quickly realized that Elijah's emotional walls were just as formidable as the physical ones surrounding his cabin. He was abrupt in conversation, often retreating into silence when she attempted to connect on a personal level. When she tried to inquire about his past or ask about his family, his responses were clipped, tinged with a sadness that he seemed desperate to contain. Clara's natural curiosity and empathy clashed with Elijah's reticence, creating tension that neither fully understood. She wanted to break through his defenses, while he feared vulnerability, having been shaped by years of isolation and loss. One particular incident underscored the fragility of their developing relationship. Clara, attempting to bring warmth and liveliness into the cabin, moved a piece of furniture to create a more inviting sitting area. Elijah returned from chopping wood to find the arrangement altered and immediately reacted with visible frustration. His voice, usually quiet and controlled, rose with sharpness, and his hands gestured emphatically toward the displaced items. Clara felt her heart race, caught between fear and determination. She wanted to retreat, but also felt compelled to stand her ground, explaining gently that her intention had been to make the space more comfortable for both of them. The conversation ended with neither fully satisfied, but it revealed a critical truth. Trust and understanding between them would not come easily, and even small actions carried significant emotional weight. Despite these early conflicts, moments of progress began to appear. Elijah, though still guarded, started to acknowledge her efforts with subtle approval. A nod, a brief word of thanks, or a softened tone when addressing her mistakes. Clara, in turn, learned to anticipate his expectations, to observe his routines carefully, and to approach her work with both precision and sensitivity. The tension between them, rather than creating division, began to form the basis of a cautious partnership. Each challenge tested their patience, but it also provided opportunities to understand one another more deeply. By the end of this period, Clara had gained a clearer picture of Elijah, not just as a mountain man, but as a person who had been shaped by loss, solitude, and a deep sense of responsibility for his domain. Their early conflicts, though uncomfortable, were essential in establishing the boundaries and dynamics of their relationship. They highlighted the need for communication, compromise, and empathy, and they set the stage for the emotional breakthroughs that would follow. It became evident that living together in the cabin was not just about completing chores. It was about navigating the delicate balance between independence and connection, between pride and trust. After several weeks of working alongside Elijah, Clara began to notice subtle changes in his demeanor. The initial tension that had characterized their early interactions had softened, giving way to cautious tolerance and occasional hints of curiosity. Their shared space, the cabin, the forest paths, and the small clearing where Elijah chopped wood, had become a silent witness to the gradual breaking down of barriers. It was during one of these quiet evenings, with the fading light filtering through the cabin windows, that the first real conversation of emotional significance took place. That evening, Clara had prepared a simple meal and set it on the wooden table near the fireplace. Elijah, usually reticent, sat across from her without the habitual brusqueness. He accepted the meal with a nod, his eyes briefly meeting hers before returning to the steaming dishes. For a long while, silence prevailed, filled only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl outside. Clara, sensing an opportunity, chose her moment carefully. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly, her gaze lingering on a photograph on the mantel. A faded image of a woman and two children smiling in what seemed like a happier time. Elijah's response was slow, almost pained. He looked at the photograph for a long moment, tracing the outlines of the faces with his eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "Every day." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. They conveyed loss, regret, and a deep-seated longing for connection that had been absent from his life for too long. Clara listened intently, not interrupting, allowing him the space to reveal himself. She realized that this was not merely a story of sorrow. It was a glimpse into the experiences that had shaped the man before her. the events that had forged both his strength and his isolation. Moved by his honesty, Clara decided to share her own story. She spoke of her life in the city, the disappointments, the moments of loneliness, and the persistent desire to find a place where she could truly belong. She spoke not with self-pity but with honesty and vulnerability, allowing Elijah to see the real person beneath her composed exterior. As she spoke, she noticed his posture relaxing slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. For the first time, the distance between them seemed to shrink, bridged by shared experience and mutual understanding. The conversation continued well into the evening. Elijah, encouraged by Clara's openness, began to recount more details of his past, the love he had lost, the family he had once cherished, and the tragedy that had driven him into isolation. His voice wavered at times, betraying emotions he had long suppressed. Clara responded with empathy, her presence a quiet reassurance that his pain was acknowledged rather than judged. Through these shared stories, they began to understand each other not merely as companions in a physical space, but as individuals with complex inner lives, each shaped by experiences of loss, resilience, and hope. These moments of storytelling became ritualistic over time, forming the foundation of their emotional bond. The cabin, once a place of silent cohabitation, transformed into a space of dialogue and intimacy. They discovered common values, overlapping dreams, and complementary strengths. Clara's courage in sharing her vulnerabilities inspired Elijah to lower his defenses, while his willingness to reveal his history demonstrated trust and respect for her presence. By the end of this phase, the dynamic between them had shifted significantly. They were no longer merely two people living under the same roof. They had become companions in a journey of mutual discovery. The shared stories allowed them to connect on a profound emotional level, setting the stage for deeper trust, compassion, and eventually, love. Clara began to see Elijah not as the distant, intimidating mountain man of legend, but as a human being, shaped by triumphs and losses, capable of tenderness and profound feeling. And Elijah, in turn, recognized in Clara a kindred spirit, someone willing to meet him not with judgment, but with understanding, a presence that could finally begin to heal the solitude he had carried for so long. As the days turned into weeks, the relationship between Clara and Elijah began to deepen in ways neither of them had anticipated. Their shared routines and small interactions had laid a foundation of familiarity, but it was during moments of vulnerability that their emotional connection truly began to take shape. The mountain man, long accustomed to solitude and emotional restraint, had rarely allowed anyone to glimpse the depths of his feelings. Clara's presence, her patience, and her unassuming courage gradually created an environment where such revelations became possible. One late afternoon, a sudden storm swept through the mountains. The wind howled through the pines, rain streaked the windows, and the fire in the cabin flickered under the pressure of gusting drafts. Clara, concerned about the growing intensity of the storm, moved quickly to secure the cabin, checking windows and doors, stacking extra firewood near the hearth, and making sure the animals in the small enclosure outside were sheltered. Elijah, focused on chopping wood earlier in the day, returned to find Clara busy with these preparations. There was tension in the air, not from conflict, but from the raw power of nature and the shared realization that they were both vulnerable to its force. The storm created an unusual sense of intimacy. Confined to the cabin, they were forced into close proximity, their personal spaces overlapping in ways that were both literal and emotional. Clara noticed subtle signs of Elijah's fragility, the tremor in his hands as he tried to adjust a lantern, the furrow of worry etched across his weathered face, and the brief, almost imperceptible hesitation in his movements. These were small cracks in the armor he had built over years of isolation, and Clara recognized them immediately. She approached him gently, offering reassurance with words and gestures rather than force. "It's all right," she said softly. "We'll get through this together." It was in this quiet, charged moment that Elijah's long-suppressed emotions surfaced. The man who had always relied on stoicism and self-reliance now found himself confronting feelings that were both overwhelming and unfamiliar. Clara's calm presence acted as a mirror, reflecting back the humanity he had buried deep inside. He could no longer maintain his usual composure, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry. The tears were not just an expression of fear or frustration. They were a release of accumulated grief, regret, and longing. In the past, he had borne such emotions in silence, believing that showing them would be a sign of weakness. But in Clara's presence, he discovered that vulnerability could coexist with strength. Clara's response was instinctive and compassionate. She did not recoil or offer platitudes. She simply allowed him the space to express what he had long denied himself. Sitting nearby, she held his hand lightly, offering support without intrusion. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, a sense of emotional safety prevailed. In that shared vulnerability, the unspoken trust between them deepened significantly. This moment marked a turning point in their relationship, the acknowledgement that their connection could withstand raw emotion, and that both could rely on each other, not only for physical survival in the mountains, but also for emotional sustenance. Following the storm, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. There was a newfound tenderness in their interactions, small touches, lingering glances, and gestures of care that had previously been absent. Clara saw Elijah's tears not as a weakness, but as an indication of his capacity to feel deeply. Elijah, in turn, recognized that Clara's empathy and strength were a rare and precious gift, one that allowed him to confront parts of himself he had long avoided. The storm and the vulnerability it evoked became symbolic of their journey together, a reminder that love and trust require openness, courage, and the willingness to face both internal and external challenges together. By the end of this period, both Clara and Elijah had undergone subtle but profound transformations. The cabin, once a space of isolation, had become a sanctuary for emotional honesty. The mountain man, once unyielding and solitary, was beginning to discover that vulnerability could be shared without fear, and Clara was proving that patience and empathy could penetrate even the most fortified hearts. It was a quiet, powerful step toward the deep emotional bond that would define the next stage of their story. The turning point in Clara and Elijah's relationship came unexpectedly, in a moment of sudden danger that laid bare both their vulnerabilities and their growing reliance on one another. It was early morning when Elijah, as was his routine, went to chop wood near the edge of a steep slope. The mountain terrain, while familiar to him, was unforgiving. The ground was slick with dew and scattered with loose stones. Clara had accompanied him, eager to continue learning the practical skills he valued and to prove that she was capable of more than household tasks. She had always admired his strength and precision, but now she saw firsthand how easily nature could challenge even someone so skilled. As Elijah swung his axe, the log he struck split in an unexpected direction, sending a piece of wood careening toward the slope. In a moment of instinct, he stepped back, but the ground beneath his foot gave way slightly. He stumbled, losing balance near the edge. Time seemed to slow for Clara, who watched in horror as he teetered dangerously close to a fall that could have serious consequences. Without hesitation, she rushed forward, grabbing his arm just in time to steady him. Her quick reflexes and fearless action prevented disaster, and for the first time, Elijah experienced a moment of vulnerability not caused by his emotions, but by the unpredictability of the world around him. The incident left them both shaken. Elijah, normally the picture of control and stoicism, stood silently for a long moment, gripping Clara's hand tightly as if grounding himself. His usual reserve was gone, replaced by a mix of gratitude, relief, and an overwhelming awareness of how much he had come to rely on her presence. Clara, equally affected, felt a surge of emotion, concern, admiration, and a deepening bond that transcended words. It was no longer just about chores, routines, or survival. It was about trust, courage, and the realization that their lives had become entwined in ways neither had anticipated. In the days following the accident, Elijah's behavior began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. He started to show more patience and attentiveness toward Clara, guiding her through tasks not with curt instructions but with gentle corrections and shared techniques. He invited her into aspects of his world that he had previously managed alone, repairing the cabin, tending the animals, and even taking her along on trips to gather firewood from more challenging parts of the forest. These gestures, though understated, signaled a profound shift. Elijah was acknowledging her not merely as an assistant or guest, but as a trusted companion, capable of sharing in both labor and responsibility. The turning point also extended to the emotional realm. The near accident sparked candid conversations between them about fear, trust, and interdependence. Elijah spoke more openly about his reliance on routines to feel secure and admitted that Clara's presence had introduced an unfamiliar but welcome disruption into his life. Clara, in turn, shared how witnessing his vulnerability made her feel closer to him, not weaker, reinforcing the idea that connection involved mutual risk and care. These exchanges, layered with honesty and empathy, cemented the emotional foundation they had been building through weeks of shared experiences. By the end of this period, their relationship had evolved beyond simple companionship or mutual tolerance. The turning point, the incident on the slope, served as a catalyst for trust, respect, and recognition of each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. Clara saw Elijah's formidable exterior as both a shield and a sign of his humanity, while Elijah realized that true strength included the willingness to accept help and share responsibility. From this moment forward, their bond was no longer tentative. It was a partnership built on courage, trust, and an understanding that each could rely on the other in both practical and emotional matters. This episode marked a pivotal moment in the story, bridging the gap between cautious coexistence and genuine intimacy. The physical and emotional challenges they faced together became a metaphor for the journey ahead. Navigating the unpredictable terrain of life and love, learning to balance independence with interdependence, and embracing the vulnerability that allows two hearts to grow closer in ways both profound and lasting. The confession between Clara and Elijah marked a profound shift in the trajectory of their relationship, transforming the cautious bond they had built into one of emotional intimacy and undeniable love. Up until this point, their connection had been carefully nurtured through shared experiences. Small acts of trust and the gradual breaking down of walls that years of solitude had constructed around Elijah's heart. Yet despite the closeness that had developed, both remained acutely aware of the lingering fears and vulnerabilities that still separated them. The confession was not a sudden outburst of emotion, but the culmination of weeks of observation, patience, and subtle emotional negotiation, emerging naturally from a shared moment of reflection, one quiet evening. It was late afternoon, and the sun had begun its descent behind the jagged mountain peaks, casting long golden shadows across the cabin's wooden floor. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and the lingering smoke from the fire. Clara had been tidying the cabin when Elijah appeared at the doorway, his presence unexpectedly still, his usual stoicism softened by an intensity that caught her off guard. He gestured for her to sit beside him on a rough-hewn bench near the fireplace, and for a moment silence prevailed, heavy with unspoken feelings. Clara, sensing the gravity of the moment, allowed herself to sit close, her hands resting near his, though not yet touching. The closeness, charged with both anticipation and uncertainty, created a space where honesty could finally emerge. Elijah began in a measured, deliberate voice, admitting feelings he had long struggled to acknowledge. He spoke of how Clara's presence had reshaped his daily life, not just through her practical contributions to the cabin and chores, but by softening the rigidity he had relied on for survival. He revealed the depth of the emotional walls he had erected over years of grief and isolation, and confessed that her kindness, courage, and persistence had chipped away at them in ways he had not thought possible. His words were tinged with vulnerability. He admitted fear, not of losing her in a conventional sense, but of allowing himself to feel so deeply again, and confronting the possibility of new heartbreak. Clara listened quietly, her own emotions swelling as she absorbed his confession. She recognized in his words the man she had come to know, the man who was formidable, solitary, and fiercely self-reliant, yet beneath it all capable of tenderness, empathy, and deep love. When it was her turn to speak, she mirrored his honesty, sharing how his strength, resilience, and authenticity had inspired trust and admiration in her heart. She admitted that she had found not just companionship, but a sense of home and belonging with him, a recognition that the life she had long sought existed not in isolation, but in partnership with someone who understood and respected her. As their confessions intertwined, the emotional tension that had long simmered between them finally released. Elijah, unaccustomed to verbalizing his feelings so directly, allowed himself to be entirely present in the moment, his usual stoic exterior giving way to raw, genuine emotion. Clara responded with a mix of warmth, encouragement, and quiet affirmation, her presence providing the safety and reassurance he had longed for without consciously realizing it. In this shared honesty, they discovered a mutual acceptance that transcended fear and hesitation. The confession transformed their relationship. It was no longer defined by guarded interactions or subtle hints of care. It became a partnership grounded in trust, emotional transparency, and the acknowledgement of shared vulnerability. For Elijah, admitting his feelings was an act of courage, a step toward reclaiming the parts of himself he had hidden away. For Clara, the confession affirmed the emotional risks she had taken in investing herself in someone so initially formidable. Together, they entered a new phase of intimacy, one that promised growth, healing, and the possibility of love fully realized. The evening closed with a quiet, profound stillness. The fire crackled, shadows danced across the walls, and the mountains outside stood as silent witnesses to the emotional breakthrough that had taken place. In the simple act of confessing their hearts, Clara and Elijah found a new equilibrium, one in which love was no longer a tentative possibility but a present, living reality, ready to shape the chapters of their shared life ahead. With the emotional confession behind them, Clara and Elijah's relationship had entered a phase of mutual trust and openness. They had shared their vulnerabilities, acknowledged their feelings, and begun to weave their lives together within the protective walls of the cabin. However, life in isolation could not shield them forever from the judgments, expectations, and curiosity of the outside world. As their bond strengthened, they both realized that the villagers and the broader community would inevitably take notice, and not all reactions would be welcoming. The first signs came subtly. Villagers, who had long regarded Elijah as a distant and solitary figure, began to whisper when they saw Clara walking near the cabin or assisting him with chores. Some expressed surprise, others skepticism, wondering what had prompted the mountain man to allow someone into his life so intimately. The very act of permitting companionship challenged the reputation Elijah had cultivated over years of isolation, and some could not reconcile the gruff, formidable man they had known with the warmth and openness now visible in his interactions with Clara. Rumors began to circulate, small but persistent. Some questioned Clara's intentions, while others speculated that Elijah had softened too easily, a man of his reputation unlikely to trust anyone. For Clara and Elijah, navigating this scrutiny required a careful balance. Elijah, who had spent decades avoiding the judgment of others, initially responded with wariness, retreating into silence when villagers made comments or watched them from a distance. Clara, however, had learned through their shared experiences the importance of patience, courage, and steadfastness. She encouraged Elijah to face the villagers, to engage without defensiveness, and to recognize that their relationship, rooted in trust and understanding, was not dictated by external opinion. She reminded him that their bond was real and meaningful, and that no rumor or whisper could diminish the depth of what they shared. Their first deliberate step toward engaging the outside world occurred when a neighbor stopped by with supplies. Elijah, though initially tense, allowed Clara to greet the visitor and converse openly. He observed quietly, gradually realizing that their partnership had prepared them to handle social interactions as a united front. Clara's confidence and composure served as a model, helping him navigate a social landscape that had once been intimidating. The villagers, in turn, began to see a different side of Elijah, one shaped not just by solitude and strength, but also by trust, respect, and capacity for love. Over time, more significant challenges arose. Some villagers, skeptical of Clara's intentions, attempted to question her character or cast doubt on her influence over Elijah. Others expressed concern that the mountain man might be vulnerable to manipulation or disappointment. These moments tested both Clara and Elijah, forcing them to reaffirm their commitment to each other and to confront societal judgment together. The experience strengthened their bond, demonstrating that external pressures could not erode the foundation of trust and love they had painstakingly built. By actively engaging with the villagers, Clara and Elijah began to shift perceptions. The same people who once regarded Elijah with awe and caution now saw a man capable of kindness, emotional depth, and partnership. Clara's presence humanized him in ways that practical assistance alone could not. Her empathy and courage highlighted his transformation. Likewise, the villagers gradually recognized Clara's integrity, resilience, and authenticity, realizing that she had not only earned Elijah's trust, but had also become an indispensable presence in his life. Facing the outside world ultimately became a milestone in their relationship. It reinforced the idea that love and connection, though initially cultivated in isolation, must withstand societal scrutiny to endure. For Clara and Elijah, these challenges were not obstacles but opportunities to assert their autonomy, demonstrate their mutual trust, and show that their bond was self-defined rather than dictated by expectation. By confronting external judgment together, they strengthened their partnership and prepared themselves for the final stages of their shared journey, a life built not on fear or isolation, but on trust, courage, and the enduring power of love. The story's conclusion: the emotional homecoming represents the culmination of Clara and Elijah's journey, a synthesis of personal growth, trust, and love that had been carefully nurtured over weeks of shared experience and vulnerability. After navigating the challenges of life in the mountains, breaking down emotional barriers, surviving near disasters, and facing the scrutiny of the outside world, both had arrived at a point of profound connection and mutual understanding. The cabin, which had once been a fortress of solitude, now symbolized the home they had built together, a place of safety, warmth, and emotional authenticity. The day began with a quiet sunrise, casting golden light over the mountains and the cabin. Clara and Elijah stood together on the porch, a rare moment of stillness enveloping them. The valley below was bathed in soft morning light, the wind carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of wildlife. There was a serenity in the air that contrasted sharply with the tension, uncertainty, and fear they had faced in the earlier stages of their relationship. For Elijah, the beauty of the morning was amplified by the realization that he was no longer alone in experiencing life's moments. Clara was beside him, sharing in the small joys and quiet wonder that the mountains provided. Their emotional homecoming was as much internal as it was external. Elijah, once defined by his solitude, stoicism, and self-reliance, now allowed himself to feel fully, not only love and trust, but also hope and joy. Clara's presence had softened the rigidity he had relied on for survival, allowing him to embrace his emotions without fear of judgment. As he looked at her, he saw not just a companion, but a partner who had patiently, courageously, and compassionately guided him back to life beyond isolation. For Clara, the emotional homecoming was a validation of her intuition and persistence. She had entered Elijah's world not with grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but with steady care, empathy, and courage. And now she witnessed the profound effect she had on his heart. This moment of resolution also reflected the equilibrium they had achieved with the outside world. Villagers who once whispered or doubted them now approached with respect and admiration, having witnessed the bond between the two. Elijah, once wary of judgment, interacted with the community confidently, with Clara by his side. Their partnership was no longer fragile or tentative. It was a visible testament to trust, love, and resilience. The cabin, perched above the valley, became a symbol not of isolation, but of connection, an emblem of a life fully shared and intentionally built together. In their private moments, the couple allowed themselves the small intimacies that had been absent during earlier stages of their relationship. Holding hands as they watched the sunrise, sharing quiet laughter, or simply sitting together in silence, they experienced a profound sense of completeness. Elijah, who had once only known grief and solitude, now had a home not just in the physical sense but emotionally and spiritually. Clara, who had sought a place to belong, found it not in a city or a conventional community, but in the life she and Elijah had created together. The emotional homecoming also carried a sense of healing. Both carried scars, Elijah from loss and isolation, Clara from uncertainty and past struggles, but in each other's presence, those scars became part of a shared narrative rather than sources of pain. They had learned to embrace vulnerability, to face challenges together, and to recognize the strength that comes from interdependence. By allowing themselves to feel fully, they completed a journey of transformation, from guarded individuals to a couple defined by empathy, love, and mutual respect. As the story closes, Clara whispers the words she had first spoken upon seeing the cabin. "You're bigger than my house." But now, the meaning is layered and complete. It reflects not only Elijah's physical stature or the grandeur of his home, but the expansiveness of his heart and the life they had built together. Elijah, tears in his eyes, can only respond with a quiet, unguarded emotion, fully present in a love that has been earned, nurtured, and embraced. The emotional homecoming is a testament to resilience, connection, and the transformative power of shared vulnerability, a perfect resolution to a story of solitude, trust, and the enduring promise of human intimacy.